Hello. Hello to everyone in the audience. Thanks for joining our spotlight discussion on the latest developments in anti-money laundering policy in the EU. And please don't forget to send us your questions on the Swapcard platform, which you should be able to see under the live discussion button on the screen there. And there's also a poll for members of the audience asking what should the EU do to crack down on money laundering. A, introduce a new watchdog. B, harmonize due diligence rules. Or C, scrutinize non-financial firms more. Tweet about our Financial Services Summit with the hashtag POLITICO FS. We have a distinguished panel, Mr. Jose Manuel Campa, the chairman of the European Banking Authority, Charlie Delingpole, the founder and chief executive of Comply Advantage, which is a technology company using very sophisticated technology and software to fight money laundering, to help financial companies follow the money laundering regulations. And we have Sven Giegold, the German MEP, who is really well known as a tireless campaigner on the issue of money laundering and also tax evasion, which is sort of related. So I'm going to start with a remark I had that about a year ago, the European fight against money laundering was probably the most important policy topic in the financial services world. But unfortunately, the pandemic came in the meantime. And I just wonder if any of the panelists, when I get to them in turn, feel like somehow the urgency, the sense of urgency on money laundering in financial services has abated a little bit. And I would like to first start with Mr. Campa, if you will tell us, please, what is the latest in the development of the EU's new regulatory framework against money laundering, please.
Thank you. And thank you for giving me the floor. First of all, thank you for inviting me and for organizing this panel. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I think that coming right to your question, I don't think at all that the AML has been deprioritized as one of the key areas in which progress needs to be made in the European Union. On the contrary, I would suggest, and we can delve in that a bit longer, that the COVID-19 pandemic, like with many other trends in society, has accelerated the need to advance in this area. We have, as you say, we have been working since January of last year, in which we got a harmonized mandate to lead policy coordination in the European Union on these AML grounds, on trying to enhance the supervisory framework environment in which the financial institutions in the EU engage AML. We have created an AML committee in which all authorities across the Union, 68 authorities that have a mandate on the AML ground, meet to assess the situation of the AML supervision. We have, more important, I think, established AML colleges for the major financial institutions, in which the AML authorities discuss the specifics of each bank AML situation, or financial institution AML situation, I should say. We also have engaged with the Council of Europe to do implementation reviews. This is a multi-year process over 3 years, in which we will do a review of the implementation of supervisory practices across all the EU AML member states. And this has already provided some fruits. Last December, we published our first report on this area, both on the area of colleges and on AML implementation reviews. And we have made two important pieces that I think are helpful for the audience today. One is we publish our guidelines on AML risk factors. This is a point that I hope will come back to the debate. One of the challenges that we have in the AML ground is that a lot of the supervisory practices are not sufficiently risk-based. They tend to be too much, many times just box ticking or going through formulas rather than seriously thinking about the risk exposure and the risk assessments that the different entities expose themselves and they might expose the system through AML, through their practices to potential AML. And the second part that we published just this week was an opinion on the AML risks and what are the flagrant risks. And just to highlight some of the areas that we highlight as COVID-19, one of the areas in which we think that has actually increased potential AML risk in some parts. But of course, there are other parts in the area of financial innovation, in virtual currencies, in fintech, where there are new players, there are new developments, there are new ways of doing things. And the AML authorities, the capital authorities of Puerto Rico have challenges in that part. Apart from that, I would say that they will also have serious challenges arising from the divergence in practices of supervisory implementation of AML activities across the union, and that authorities need to continue to work on that. And then finally, but not least important, we need to enhance the regulatory framework in which we operate. And here I think that the Commission's proposal should help us in that direction going forward. Let me stop here for now.
Thank you. I'm going to pass it on to Charlie, but I'm going to change the question a little bit and ask if, from your point of view, dealing with industry players in so many countries on a daily basis, do you see perhaps different approaches to the issue of money laundering from different authorities? And what do you think should be the main priority of our regulators today?
Great question, and thank you so much for having me on today with such a great panel. So we work with companies operating in over 80 countries, and I'd say that the EU has definitely been the leader in enforcing anti-money laundering regulation. I think in particular, what you see in the US is a reliance on screening the kind of 7,000 names on the US Treasury OFAC enforcement list. Whereas I think with the kind of fourth and fifth money laundering directive, there was a huge step change in terms of the breadth and depth of technology usage and the level of diligence on counterparties. I think still, even though the EU is leading the way and has done fantastic work, I think, as pointed out in the fantastic reports from the EBA that came out yesterday, published by Jose and his team, I think there are still opportunities and also risks. I think most of the risks lie in the kind of high growth fintech area, and in particular, those companies incorporating from overseas in the Baltic states and elsewhere. I think in terms of the growth of things like adverse media around cybercrime, human trafficking, I think that's probably the next wave of potential in terms of, although we're screening for political exposure and sanctions risk, I think the range of crimes as enumerated in the fifth money laundering directive can also be expanded. And I think that will be the next real enhancement of the risks and reduction in risks.
Right. And Mr. Giegold, as a lawmaker and frequent critic of EU authorities and in general big players in the banking system, would you tell us how you feel about the progress made so far in the EU on money laundering, and where should the focus be put next?
Well, I personally believe in evidence-based assessments, and we do not fight AML by better procedures. We should look at the results, and there the boss of Europol has put it best. So we confiscate less than 1% of the money made with crime. And this shows that objectively, the result of fighting AML is not satisfactory. It is far from being satisfactory. And of course, we know the list of weaknesses, but only to show one thing, when you look at the last round of FRTF inspections and evaluations, also the 18 EU member states evaluated recently did not perform to a high level of implementation. And therefore, the real issue is implementation, and fighting the loopholes. And therefore, it's good that the EU wants to create a unique supervisor. It is important to give it real powers, in particular, also beyond the banks. And also for the time being, the existing institutions like the EU Commission, but also the EBA, should use all its powers in order to fight the implementation gap.
Right. Speaking of that, I think Mr. Kampa also mentioned earlier that there are emerging risks in the fintech industry. Charlie confirmed this. Now, there's reports on Wirecard specifically, which was structured as a fintech company that owned a bank, which is not the typical way to structure a big financial company, but so it was. And there's reports that Wirecard might have been having issues with money laundering as well, on top of the fraud that was discovered. So I wonder, will this new regulatory body devise rules to better supervise fintech companies that are not licensed necessarily as banks? Mr. Kampa.
If I may, thank you, because this is, I agree with you, and I agree with Charles as well. It's one of the issues that we highlight more in our opinion on risks, which is that, the arisal of fintech, virtual currencies, crowdfunded platforms, these are areas in which, because they're new, they pose new challenges, and they're important that need to be tackled. The challenges that are basically of three characteristics. The first one, the new players themselves sometimes are not aware of their obligations in the AML front. Some of them just because they don't come from the finance world, or they don't. They're small and they're building up, so they're not familiar with all the obligations in that front, and that's important to get familiar as. Second aspect, on the other side, if I'm honest with you, is that many of the supervisors and the authorities that are supposed to implement the supervision are not familiar with the technologies that are being put in place, the implications that those technologies may have, and how to properly supervise it. So, for instance, we see that the use of a same technology across the union has different approaches from the point of view of national AML supervisors on what should be, or what should be allowed or not, and what characteristics are positive or not in that part. And then finally, the third aspect, which I think is important, is about aspect of perimeter. The regulation, sometimes the regulation, sometimes the mandate on the national supervision authorities do not include some of these new players, and that's important. That's one of the key recommendations that we have put forward. For instance, for virtual asset service providers, for wallet providers in terms of virtual currencies, those are new perimeter players that need to be included in the regulation. And I hope that the digital strategy of the Commission that was put forward late last year already addresses this. If they go forward with an AML reform, that would need to be included as well. In our risk factor guidelines, for the first time, we actually have put in there payment service providers as one of the key players that need to be within the perimeter of AML.
Right. Charlie, have you noticed in your interaction with fintech companies a lack of awareness of obligations? And on the other hand, have you seen supervisors being left behind by emerging technologies in Europe? And I would like to put you on the spot a little bit and ask you to tell us which countries are doing a worse job at keeping up with emerging technologies, please.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think as Sven pointed out, the real challenge is implementation. And I think it's great that the EBA and other supervisory authorities are keeping the pressure up. I think, so my previous job was trying to implement all these changes, and it's a huge challenge. But I think the real advantage of fintech is that you actually can implement those changes, and it's possible because you can use new technology, you're able to invest, and you haven't got all the legacy technology. I think what you see in the big banks is a real challenge in terms of being able to invest, in terms of being able to adopt new technology. And often it's simply the threat of the new entrants, which gives them permission to innovate. So if you talk to someone like HSBC, the only reason why they could launch remote onboarding was because Monzo had done that, right? So I think at the same time, there is real pressure to invest in this area, and often the biggest team of a fintech will be the compliance team. So I think in terms of RegTech and innovation there, that's really coming along quickly. I think in terms of speaking to companies all over the EU, I wouldn't say in any particular jurisdiction is overly weak. I think perhaps the Baltic states have many more new entrants from overseas who are choosing to incorporate there because the Bank of Lithuania or other regulators are much more welcoming. But I think really the progress being made is strong, and we have to watch out for those kind of rogue institutions which are exploiting divisions, or as you say, complexity, as in what we saw today was with a company called Greensill, which was a German-based bank go into insolvency, and that was around the obscurity and complexity of supply chain finance. So it's really, wherever there's some sort of unnecessary complexity and obscurity, you'll find money laundering or some sort of problems related to that.
Right. Thanks. You didn't go as far as I would like in criticizing national authorities, but maybe Mr. Giegold will. And I would like to add another an addendum to the question. The new European regulatory body that is being created, that is being discussed. What is your view on the balance between the power of the body itself and the power delegated to national competent authorities? Mr. Giegold.
Well, first of all, I would like to say that I think it is really important that not only banks and crypto assets are included in the area of competence, but that we fully include all different forms of payment providers. So I hear more and more from practitioners in AML that there are growing problems, that there are also forms of circumvention of know your customer and also by clear traceability of the respective transfers. And I think that is very important to tackle in a really wide way. One of the lessons of Wirecard was also, and Mr. Dombrovskis pointed to this in his first reaction, that the so-called service providers, so service providers which are more technical service providers, that they should also be watched and not being excluded from the AML framework. And this was one of the big mistakes which we can learn from this embarrassing Wirecard scandal. As you want me to talk about member states, I think it is important to say that this is not an issue of only some small Baltic countries or Malta or Cyprus. Money laundering is happening also in the large member states. And in particular, Germany is known for having a very weak prevention system. And also when it comes to the law enforcement, we are not good. And therefore, it's good that the European Commission recently opened a treaty infringement proceeding against Germany, not based on transposition of law, but on bad implementation. And the Commission should be much more. But I would like to ask Mr. Kamper, I know that the EBA has acted quite strongly on Pilatus Bank and used a violation of union law. We have quite good legislation in Europe, but in many institutions, it's not perfectly, not fully, not satisfactorily implemented. And therefore, I'm curious to know how many cases of violation of union law have you opened in your area of competence with a view to AML legislation? Could you explain that to us? And when will you do more? So if the implementation gap is so big, as also the colleague on the panel confirmed, when will you come up with the respective use of your competence in this area? We should not wait for the AML supervisor.
There we have it. Mr. Giegold is getting fired up. I'm going to.
Well, I have to earn my bread as well, right? So that's my job here, isn't it?
We were relying on that. So thanks very much. Hopefully the audience is engaging as well. So yes, Mr. Kampa, what do you think about that? Why isn't the EBA opening more cases? And how do you argue? Do you argue in favor or against the new EU authority having more power over local state authorities when these ones don't do their job properly?
Yeah, well, thank you. This is a very ongoing conversation with Sven Giegel, so we know very well the issues that are confronted. Your second part of the question is the easy part. You know, is of course we think that, and this was one of the recommendations that we put in the response to the call for advice from the Commission when they were put forward their consultation on the new AML powers. We do think that the more AML powers need to be granted to potential supervisory at the European Union level if that were to be agreed upon. But beyond that, regulation needs to be sharpened, and regulation needs to be sharpened so that the implementation can be made in a more effective and precise manner. Part of the challenge that we have in the AML arena, and this is part of the reasons why this debate about the breach of union law, when does it happen, when does it not happen, is that some of the current regulation is very principle-based, and it just provides general principles and general guidelines that do not require, that leave a lot of room for proper implementation, or what's considered proper implementation across many of the member countries. So therefore, it's very difficult sometimes to argue with some member countries, although you might think that the resources that are being put in place or the actions that have taken, they seem disproportionate to be considered proper, whether it's proper or improper. We have other mechanisms that have been given to us under the EBA new legislation. Particularly, I won't go into details, but something that's called investigation under Article 9. We're pursuing a number of those. Some of them linked to public information that has come out on the public front, other ones more bilateral through the authorities. So those are the initial stages before getting into, as it's been said, the breach of union law, which has been a tool that actually out of the three ESAs, it's only the EBA that has been implemented successfully. Let's put it this way. If by successful we mean, which I'll challenge that, but we mean that a case is open, because I think that instrument in many ways acts as a deterrent in many of our discussions with competent authorities. You know, as we go forward in elevating our concerns and with solid signal to a breach of union law procedures, sometimes, you know, the authorities are able to implement better their procedures, and therefore we don't actually enforce the breach of union law. So I would say that the breach of union law is one of our tools in our toolkit. Is very good, but we should not be focusing too much on just that one, because there are many other processes.
Right.
So how many
thanks for that.
cases
There's a question from the audience as well, from one of our viewers, asking whether maybe it's a better idea to have an anti-money laundering regulation rather than a directive, meaning with a regulation, everybody has to apply the same rules. There's no room for a little bit of tweaking here and there to make your own country a little bit more competitive. And I would like to pass this to Charlie and ask him for average player in the market looking to comply with the rules and invest as little as possible in enacting lawfully. Would it be perhaps cheaper to have one uniform regulation across Europe rather than a bunch of different regimes which you have to keep up with?
Yeah, I think one of the key dimensions highlighted in the report published by the EBA yesterday was the potential risks around remote onboarding. And I think what you see there is a huge range of differential policies and procedures. In terms of Germany, you're allowed to do video onboarding. In others, you're allowed to do document onboarding. And what that means is there's a whole divergence in terms of possibilities, and that definitely opens up some form of arbitrage. I guess in terms of other models, in the US, rather than having passporting, you have state-by-state licensing, but then with the OCC which licenses some national banks which are regulated at the federal level. So I think part of the changes in terms of having a single EU regulatory authority and then also having, say, one law across the whole EU rather than directives could be that you have a class of banks that are centrally regulated. In terms of the benefits around that, I think it would be a lot simpler. But then in terms of whether or not you want to allow a whole tranche of companies to have that regulation, I think it would be a huge burden upon the actual licensing authority.
So, Mr. Giegold, how do you see that? Where do you stand on an AML regulation versus a directive? Is it too much for? Please go ahead.
No, well, the Council as well as the Parliament and the Commission have made clear that key areas of the directive will be transferred into a regulation. And some of the important issues are quite clear. Huh? So what is due diligence? How is it to be specified? And also the onboarding of customers and know your customers and how this is precisely done are clearly key candidates. And beyond that, I also believe that it's important that we cannot conceptualize an AML supervisor in Europe as being responsible for all obliged entities. There are simply too many lawyers and services companies and so on. But we should give it the right to interfere on the national level when the job is not properly done. And that is important, that there is a responsibility for the total AML system, but of course, certain functions have to be left to the national level. And that is, I think, the important balance to strike. And lastly, I've not fully understood from Jose Manuel how many cases of violation of union law with AML link are open at the moment. Could you share the figure with us?
Mr. Kampa?
Yeah, no, that's it. There's no case open. That's an easy answer. I mean, there's no active case at this stage. There were cases in the past that have been open, some of them dismissed, some of them approved, but there's no formal open right now, any open case.
So that's the answer to Mr. Giegold's question is zero.
Yeah. Right now, the question was right now, yes. Right now, the formally open AML cases, that doesn't mean there's no investigations going on a preliminary basis by the staff. But formal opening of CBA cases are known, which, by the way, is this, as I said before, the BUL case is not that often, the BUL is not that often used. In 10 years of history of the ISAs, as Mr. Giegold knows very well, the EBA has used it 4 times and the other ISAs not.
Right. So I suppose
this is not the fault of Mr. Kampa. Of course, it's the fault of the institutional setup where basically the member authorities control the institution which is supposed to control them. And that is, of course, dysfunctional. And therefore, it's so important that the AML new supervisor is built on another setup.
Right. So yeah, I agree. I think that's a fantastic point because it also goes to the limits of the EU's power and national sovereignty. And there's a balance to find there. National sovereignty. If you put national sovereignty first, you would give every country a veto over the actions of the regulator. So every time the regulator wants to do something, one country or the other is going to say no, thank you. And then with so many 27 members around the table, it becomes nearly impossible to get a move on. So how would independence work if you manage to get an independent regulator acting on its own account?
If I may to contribute to that, because I think that, like the European banking authorities were built, the European supervisory authorities actually were built originally as a regulatory body with a supervisory convergence mandate and no direct supervisory powers. And I think that this debate that we're having, which I fully share some of these concerns, I think clearly points to the difference in governance and the proper in governance for regulatory build-up or legislation build-up, for that matter, in which the contribution of member states is very important, from the different mandate that it implies to have direct supervisory powers over direct individual institutions, which is something that currently, for instance, the EBA does not have in any of its activities, right? And there, the governance, I tend to agree that will probably require different kinds of governance. Right.
Charlie, can I bring this back to you and ask from an industry perspective, is it something that you and your clients would like to see, to have a strong independent EU regulator on money laundering rather than one who is having a lot of difficulty taking action quickly?
I think speaking from a kind of American perspective, in terms of having the kind of multiple overlapping agencies where you have the OFAC agency and you have the OCC and you have FinCEN, which is kind of largely what the EU is converging towards. I think this kind of does breed a lot of complexity. So hopefully the EU, as it designs its regulatory architecture, can have a lot more simplicity and a lot more clarity over the precise level of regulation. And you avoid that kind of complexity which stems from that historical evolution, and you can design it in a much simpler way on day one. I think just to have one entity which oversees the national regulators, which can perhaps be an enforcement agency above the local ones, would probably add a lot more harmonious operational clarity, particularly as you have passporting, which allows each company to go on a pan-European basis. So I think because of the difference between the EU and the US, it does merit a kind of much stronger central authority, like a kind of OCC or FinCEN or OFAC on steroids.
On steroids, right. Well, Mr. Giegold, there's another question which is quite interesting from a member of the audience, asking, apart from financial companies and financial technology companies, which other fields of the economy should be brought under anti-money laundering supervision? But please be brief, because we have 1 minute left.
Well, I think that at least watching all the registers and ensuring the good quality of the data in the registers for the purpose of money laundering is key. And in the end, all obliged entities should be, of the AML regulation, should be included, not only finance, also real economy, but the direct supervisory power should only kick in if the lower level doesn't do it properly. So this is not a finance-only operation.
Right. Thanks very much, everyone. I'll have to bring it to a conclusion here. We have the results of the poll as well. That's why I keep moving my head, because the results are that's on that side of the screen. And apparently 54% of our audience, or the 54% of the respondents anyway, would like to see the EU harmonize due diligence rules across the bloc as a first step. So I suppose we have our consensus within the audience there. And again, thanks very much for your time and the very stimulating conversation, and hope to talk to each of you again soon. All the best.
Thank you. Bye-bye.